Hello, welcome to the FME Server Month webinars for all things FME Server. My name is Sam McDonald, and for this webinar, which is the third in our four-part series, we're going to cover enterprise integration with FME Server. As with the previous webinars, I'm going to introduce myself in a little more detail before we get started, for those who may not have attended the previous webinars, or for those who simply have forgotten who I am. I'm an electronic engineer who works with One Spatial Australia as one of their senior consultants, primarily working on delivering FME-oriented solutions to various clients and groups. If anyone watching this webinar is interested in the FME product line or delivering solutions in FME, feel free to contact me via the email on the screen. Alternatively, feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn. With that out of the way, let's quickly recap what is covered in this series, shall we? The FME Server Month webinars consist of 4 webinars in total, covering a series of topics chosen by the technical staff here at One Spatial. We have already covered our first topic, an introduction to FME Server, an overall guide to what FME Server has to offer, as well as our second topic, self-service, putting the power in your users' hands with easy to set up self-service portals. Our third topic is enterprise integration, integrating FME Server with new and existing enterprise integration patterns, and will be the topic covered in today's webinar. Finally, our fourth topic is dynamic engines and scaling, making the most of FME Server's flexibility to cut costs and improve performance. The intention of these webinars is to provide a good insight into the benefits of FME Server and how it can be easily used to deliver on commonly requested features such as you see in this roadmap. So now is about the right time to ask the question, what is enterprise integration? In a journal paper published in 2001 titled The Grand Challenges of Enterprise Integration, enterprise integration's goal was surmised as a practice that aims to connect and combines people, processes, systems, and technologies to ensure that the right people and the right processes have the right information at the right time. And I quite like this summary. Ultimately, enterprise integration is different systems and different environments working together. Given that different systems typically are comprised of different languages, different messaging formats, and so on, communication needs to be enabled, which is typically achieved through middleware, a piece of software that translates communications between two systems, and something that FME Server really shines as. Through enterprise integration, you are looking to create a highly efficient flow of data and consolidate your data between systems, ultimately providing more reliability and less redundancy within your overall architecture. Now, the reasonable follow-up question should be, Sam, you say FME Server really shines as middleware, but how does it do this? And the answer is through a few different means, which will be the core focus of this webinar. The first is connections, which includes the named connections that we can implement for web connections and database connections, as well as the ever-increasing list of transformers that are dedicated to connecting to particular services. Secondly, and my personal favorite, is automations, which are a means of implementing top-level workflows to tie in your workbenches, coupled with triggers to invoke your automation, external actions to trigger external systems, and internal actions, such as running workbenches, logging, and so on. Finally, we have a relatively newcomer as of the 2021 release, which is streams. Streams are designed to offer an easy to set up means of running jobs continuously that trigger off certain events. These use transformers that are enabled as streaming transformers, which constantly listen for an event or message from their targeted source. With these tools, you can start to do a lot to start designing and implementing patterns to integrate with internal and external systems. But instead of constantly talking about this, which admittedly I am pretty good at doing, let's start looking at these, starting with connections. So, over into FME Desktop now, and I want to start connecting to some external systems. What options do I have straight away if we start looking at some transformers? I could connect to some Microsoft services such as SharePoint, Teams, and OneDrive. I could connect to ArcGIS Online. I could connect to Autodesk's A360 or BIM 360 docs. I could connect to a range of Azure services such as blob storage, computer vision, event hubs, file storage, IoT, queue storage, service buses, and Text analysis. I could connect to Amazon services such as Athena, AWS IoT, S3, Comprehend, Recognition, and SQS. Google services such as BigQuery, Cloud Sub and Pub, Cloud Storage, Google Drive, Google IoT, Google Language, and Google Vision. Now we've already got quite a few options here, but let's just rapid fire some more. RabbitMQ, MQTT, Salesforce, Box Storage, CCM Ion, CCAN, Dropbox, Ethereum Blockchain, FME Service Resources, Hadoop Distributed File Systems, IBM IoTs, Kafka, Trello, ProjectWise, Slack. Already we have a lot of options out of the box available to us right here in FME Desktop. And if you're wondering, well, how did I find all of these? All I did was I simply typed in the word connector to start finding all the different options that are under the word connector. All of these lovely transformers that I can drop right into my canvas to start getting connected right now. The way you get connected with these transformers does change on a transformer by transformer or service by service basis, but for the most part, the majority of them start at a similar point, defining a web connection. Now, full disclosure, I will certainly not be making use of this entire list as part of this webinar due to time constraints. However, I will be setting up and demonstrating a few examples to show how easy it is to connect to different services to perform different roles. Let's start with the RabbitMQ connector, which is designed to connect to the RabbitMQ message broker on the AMQP 091 protocol. For those who may not have been exposed to it, AMQP and MQTT, while we're on the topic, are increasingly popular protocols for message broker systems. Common brokers such as Apache's ActiveMQ and Artemis, RabbitMQ and such offer both protocols. So if we're going to define a connection, we've got one or two ways. We can either go into the tools, FME options, and define a web connection here. But the fact that you can go straight through the transformer that has a web connection and define a web connection makes it very, very easy and very straightforward. And when we open up the define a web connection, you'll find that we've actually got a web connection tailored for RabbitMQ specifically. We'll start by defining a connection name, which I'm just going to call it Demo RabbitMQ. Now the host, I'm already organized, and I actually have an EC2 instance sitting with a message broker on it, so we're going to do that. Virtual host is default. The web port, the AMQP protocol typically defaults to 5672, and I haven't changed it. TLS, nope, because I'm lazy. And Sam McDonald, and password, which I will not say out loud. Done. And all we do is click OK. And what you'll find is that this account will then update to the demo RabbitMQ, which is what we've had. Easy. First connection defined. Straightforward. I'm not going to finish the transformer just yet. I will get to it because we've got two other connections to define. But that's how easy it is to get that one running. The second connection that we're going to look at is the Slack connector. Why? Because I like Slack. So we need to add a web connection. Now, unlike the RabbitMQ, which did have the fields to fill in, you'll see that we haven't got a whole lot in the Slack one. I'm just going to name it Slack Demo, similar to what I named the other one. Yeah, and we don't have any fields. All we have is this authenticate button, which when we press is actually going to redirect us to Slack's web service authentication. So there's an embedded web page that lets you authenticate like you would through just a standard web browser. Now, this one actually remembers me from last time, and it hasn't asked me for my credentials because I put them in last time, but it is asking me to, if I want to provide permission to Slack from FME Server or FME, and I do. I trust FME, I trust Safe. I'm going to click the allow button. I'm going to let that go ahead and go, well, FME is a trustworthy person, so trustworthy software, so I'm going to allow it. And what we should have is Slack Demo as the connection. Done. Last one I'm going to work with is the Dropbox connector. And again, just like the other two, what we want to do is we want to define a Dropbox account. And just like the Slack connector, we've actually got another embedded web page to go to. So we authenticate it. And this one doesn't remember me, so I'm going to have to enter my credentials. And again, not saying my password out loud. Sign in. And we need to verify. And Dropbox has interesting verification where I need to pick the spiral galaxy. And I'm going to pick the one that looks like a spiral. Once that's verified, it will ask me, similar to Slack, well, do you really want to give access to FME? Who is FME? Do they deserve access? And yes, they do. So that's going to allow it. It will just take a second to think about it. I've historically been a little impatient and mashed the allow button a couple of times just to make sure. And then I'll do it again. But when this does allow, basically just like that, that will define that connection as well. And we'll see it update as one special Dropbox. I actually forgot to rename that one. But that's fine. And there you have it. We've already defined 3 different connections to 3 different services, to a message broker, to a file storage system, and to what would you call Slack, an instant messaging environment. Slack's hard to define, but the point is that we've defined these very quickly and very easily. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to clear this workbench and start looking at how these 3 transformers that we just defined the web connections for work together. But to do that, I'm going to reveal a couple of other windows. So conveniently, what I have here is a Slack instance that we'll be using and a RabbitMQ instance, our broker instance that's hosted on an EC2 machine. These 2 will be relevant and helpful to see as I'm doing this. So just to begin, let's add our creator, because every good workbench starts with creator, and as a habit, I typically remove this creation instance, just FYI. The next thing we're going to add is a RabbitMQ connector. And what I want to do with this is I actually want to be listening to a queue. So we'll add our connection, and we're going to go to receive. And what we're going to do is we have a routing key already in place called demo, and the queue that I've already created, as you can see in the bottom right hand side, is called receive. And so we're going to just define receive. I only want to receive a batch of 1 file just to simplify things, and the only attributes we're interested in is the payload, which will be the actual message body. Done. That easy. Next one that we're going to define is our Dropbox connector. And what I want to do with the Dropbox connector is I want to download some files. Basically, I want to get the message broker to actually say what the name of the file is that we want, and then use a Dropbox connector to download that file into a interim space. So to do that, we open the Dropbox connector. The action that we want is a download. The account is the one that we specified just before. Download from path. Now, all the files that I actually am after are in the root path, and we want the name to be the payload name. So we actually do this. It's the root path followed by the value defined in the payload. And we're going to download that as an actual file. And the location that we're going to download that to, I've actually got a location already specified just on my computer. But again, we're going to retain the name by referencing that payload name. So the message broker says what file is being downloaded, and the Dropbox connector just goes with it. Finally, I want the Slack connector. Basically what I'm going to do is that not only am I going to notify this channel that a file's actually been downloaded from Dropbox, I'm actually going to upload the file to Slack. So what we need to do is we open the Slack connector, add the connection, the channel. Now the cool thing with the channels is that it actually polls via the API what Slack channels it has access to, and then it will give me a list of these channels that I can actually go ahead and choose from. And I want the file dump demo, adequately named. We're going to go with a file upload, and the title makes sense to be the payload name, but is the file name. And the actual file location is the interim space that we just defined. And we can put a comment here that says, I have retrieved file, I'll just open the text editor, payload from Dropbox. I've retrieved the file name from Dropbox. Easy, done. Click OK, and all 3 of those are good to go. So we can actually go ahead and run this now. And Just go ahead and run that workbench. Drag this up so there's a little bit of a console for people to see. And then we can come over to our message broker here. And I've got this queue defined, which is receive. I'm going to go ahead and click on that. And the browser's a little small, but basically what we have is we have this option, which is publish message. It's disappeared and then come back. So I can just go ahead and define a payload. And I'm going to, I know one of the files on this is called jokes.txt. I'm going to publish that. Message published. FME's detected that. And it's going ahead. And we've now got a file in Slack up the top. That happened very quickly. And just a few terrible, terrible dad jokes that I've got squirreled away. Like, I'm afraid for the calendar. Its days are numbered. Don't judge me. Now, we can start this workbench again. And if I wanted to do more than one message, I could actually adjust this batch value. But for the sake of this, I'm just doing one. And I actually have a brochure on this Dropbox that I'm just going to get it to retrieve now. So brochure.pdf, message published. It's going ahead and finding that. It's downloaded it and it's pushing it to Slack now. And theoretically, we've got a brochure. And look at that. It's an FME brochure. Power the flow of data. FME connects your data and applications with automated integration workflows. That certainly sounds related to what we're doing right now. But what this shows is how quickly it is not only to get these transformers stood up, but actually how quickly it was to integrate all three of these together. If I was doing this in code, this would have taken me a lot longer to do than it does in FME. And that's really convenient and demonstrates the raw power of FME. Now, as much fun as I'm having playing with these transformers in FME Desktop and showing how easy it is to get this working, I can't help but notice that we're almost 20 minutes into this presentation and I haven't actually opened FME Server yet. So I'm just going to quickly fix that. There we go. FME Server for FME Server month. As I promised, let's get into it. And as part of getting into it, let's take a look at the next item on our list, automations. Automations are a feature of FME Server that were introduced in 2019 to really leverage the existing subscriber and publisher options into creating top-level workflows that run on demand. So, with automations, you can easily design your own JSON messaging workflows in the Web Interfaces editor. These workflows will be comprised of three primary components: triggers, which listen for and receive messages from external clients or from within FME Server; external actions, which send messages to external clients or to FME Server itself; and actions, which process these messages between triggers and external actions, either in an FME workspace or through another tool such as filtering and logging. When you navigate to the Build a Automation section, you are presented with a fairly easy to use and navigate canvas in the web browser. The three primary components I just mentioned are located in the bottom left corner and can be easily dragged onto the canvas and configured. Taking a quick look, and I'll just quickly delete this existing trigger so I can show you dragging it. And taking a quick look, let's drag a trigger out to begin with. And if we go ahead and open that, we can see that there are plenty of options. For triggers, we have an Amazon S3 bucket being modified, an Amazon SNS topic being notified, an Amazon SQS message received, an Azure Grid event received, a directory watcher, a Dropbox directory watcher, emails received for IMAP and SMTP, an FME Server internal topic being notified, an FTP directory watcher, JMS message being received, an internal schedule being initiated, being triggered, an internal system event being received, a UDP message being received, a WebSocket message being received, and a webhook being triggered. Cool. We'll delete that. And for external app actions, if we drag that out, we have a lot of publishing counterparts to those triggers. And what I mean by that is they're the opposite, is in the send and receive. They're the send counterpart of it. So if we open that up, and we'll see that we have notifying an Amazon SNS topic instead of receiving a notification, or same with the Azure event grids, or we can upload to Dropbox instead of directory watching from Dropbox, for example. But there are a few unique actions here as well, such as making custom HTTP requests where you can actually just define the request type and target URL and just fill in your information for this. And for any one of these actions that you do choose, it will update your fields that you need to fill in, basically. So very easy to navigate. And then if I just, oops, I'll go ahead and delete that as well. Finally, we have actions, where we do have a few options around running workspaces and filtering and merging and logging messages. So the JSON messages that you have, you can manipulate them with these. If we look at running a workspace in an automation, we are presented with that same layout for defining the repository and workspace, which should be fairly familiar and intuitive by this point, just being able to set your repository and set your workspace. Now, I must apologize if it seems like I'm just reading from a list of things that FME can connect to by this point. I really have named quite a few. But it really is important to push my point of FME Server being an excellent piece of middleware. Safe has spent a lot of time and effort making it easily integrated and connected to different services, and the long list that I can just blatantly drone on about in a webinar such as this one is evidence of that. Resetting the canvas, let's now take a look at defining a couple of triggers. And before I do that, I'm just going to turn on the grid so that I can align things a bit nicer. The first trigger that I'm going to define is an email trigger, specifically IMAP. And I'm going to be using a Gmail account for this. So you can actually load templates for fairly commonly used providers, and we're going to use Gmail. This pre-populates the server host and the server port. The email address, it doesn't know that. I have to populate it, and the email address is FME Server month@gmail.com. Yeah, that's right, I have one prepared. The password is not going to be said out loud. The security settings, I do want to leave those as is. The polling rate, I'm actually going to scale down from 5 minutes to 5 seconds because the purpose of the demo, we don't want to be waiting too long. Typically, when you drop a polling interval for any trigger below a minute, you will get this warning saying frequent polling at short intervals may impact performance. That's true. You've been warned. Use it at your own risk. We're going to fetch new emails only, and we are going to put in a filter, which is basically for the subject. And I'm going to put in this exclamation run. And the reason I'm doing that, I've got sort of a plan for this automation where I'm going to have a few different triggers that actually look for keywords to invoke downstream processes, otherwise ignore them. So bear with me, just for the sake of the email, we just want exclamation run to be a keyword that we're looking for in the subject. We click OK, and that trigger is defined. Now what we can do is we can define a second trigger. And I'm going to drag it to a nice even space. I'm going to delete these. Whenever you create a new trigger, you'll get these next actions, and they can be very convenient because you can actually just click on them and define what action you want to do and then go from there. So it actually has the entire list instead of you wanting to come to this left here. But I'm used to using this left panel here, so that's what I'm going to continue to do. And the next one that I'm going to do is define a webhook. And when you look for a webhook, you'll actually, if you haven't saved the automation, you'll get a message saying that the webhook URL will be available after saving this automation. And there is a good reason for that, and it's related to the API. Basically, the API needs to know the automation name so that it can create this URL as a subset of that. So name, I'm just going to call it demo. Tags, we don't need any tags for this, so we're going to click OK. And now we can come back to this, and we can create the webhook. And this time around, you'll see that we actually have just a webhook URL that's already defined. So we can go ahead and click apply there. And now we have our webhook trigger as well. Looking quickly at defining a third trigger, we're going to come back to the message broker and define a JMS message received trigger. So drop the trigger, scroll down to JMS message received. And before I really start filling this out, I need to address a little snafu, is that the trigger specifically works with the JMS API, and RabbitMQ actually doesn't use the JMS API. AMQP is the protocol, JMS is the API. So we can't actually directly use RabbitMQ with this unless we are going to modify RabbitMQ to use JMS API, which frankly I'm not particularly familiar with how to do. So we can look at a couple of other options. Firstly is that we can look at using a broker that does use the JMS API and is supported out of the box with FME Server to see how quickly that is to set up. And secondly, we can actually look at the extensibility for this trigger as well. So the trigger can use AMQP, you just need to include the libraries to tell it how to do it. So let's start by implementing just a stock standard client, which would be the ActiveMQ one. So assuming that we've got an ActiveMQ broker that is using the JMS API, we would just need to specify the provider URL, which is the TCP on our EC2 instance, and it's going to be on port 61616. That's the default JMS port. The connection factory by default is connection factory. That's hard to remember. Username and password, if you're using username and password, you need to include them to authenticate. And for the queue, let's say we had a queue called demo queue. This would be all you need to do. Click apply, and you've got an active JMS trigger. But let's say we want to do something a bit more complex and we wanted AMQP here, for example. This is a good opportunity to demonstrate a little bit of extensibility in FME Server very quickly, because I'm not going to get into detail too much because I'm not going to use it for the context of this demonstration. But the first thing you would need to do is you would need to make the libraries available to FME Server. And the way that you do that is you go to the resources, you go engine, you go plugins, and these are Java libraries. So you go to the Java one, and you'll see I've already included these jar files. Basically, these tell it how to use AMQP. If you're including libraries like this, you need to restart the FME Server instance, is my understanding, because the path to this is referenced on startup. So we've got our libraries here. The next thing we would need is actually a file that tells the trigger how to actually interpret the AMQP. It doesn't know how to do it by itself. So all you would do is drop that file somewhere, and I've actually dropped it here. I've got an AMQP properties file, which specifies a connection factory, and you'll see that it has the EC2 address. It might be very hard to see in that screen, sorry. But the EC2 address is an AMQP URL this time, and that 5672 port, the same one we saw with RabbitMQ. And secondly, you'll see that we've got a queue defined that's just been named test queue, and test queue points to demo queue, what we saw earlier. So with these two in place, let's go back to the automation really quick and look at the trigger again. And what we do is we make a few changes. Firstly, instead of actually defining the provider type, we actually need to define the context that tells it what particular libraries that it's using. Secondly, we would need to specify the location of that AMQP properties file instead of the provider URL. So we're not pointing directly to the server. The server is specified in the file. So we specify the file. Thirdly, the connection factory, I called it demo broker this time in the file. And fourthly, the destination was called test queue. And that's all you would really need to do to actually get it working theoretically with a external library set. This will change depending on the client libraries and what you're trying to connect to. This one's targeted at Apache Artemis, which is the new age version of ActiveMQ. So you would just click apply, and then it would reference that file instead of directly referencing the URL. However, I don't want that in place. I want just this provider URL directly to it. So that should work. Now that I've well and truly gone into a level of technicality that no one really asks for with regard to the message trigger, let's start to really build this out. And the first thing that we want to do is add a workspace. So run a workspace, demo, and we're going to use one that I prepared earlier called the automation demo. And what this workspace does is that it actually takes the inputs from all three of these triggers and basically resolves it for the one that actually triggered it and isolates the content and then chooses a downstream process to execute based on that. So let's just apply for now. And when it pops up, the first thing that you'll probably notice is all of these individual output ports down the bottom. And what these are is these are a product of the automation writer. The automation writer is a new writer in 2020, so I guess not as new as 2021, but a new writer in 2020 that lets you basically append additional information to the JSON flow, and it's very, very valuable. And if we just swap to the workbench that this actually is, you'll be able to see it here, is that all this workbench does is take in the those parameters and basically do a bit of string manipulation on them to clean them up, and then figure out exactly what it belongs to. So there's a finite number of executions, a finite number of commands that I can run at the moment, them being coffee, which you'll find what coffee does, brochure, jokes, those two being the ones that we did previously, and message, where I can enter any message and it should replicate it. We'll get to them. And then we have the automation writer. And what the automation writer does basically is it lets me take in those inputs and write attributes to the JSON workflow, the JSON message. So very, very valuable, very handy in this context. So what we now need to do is we need to connect the rest of these to our workbench, and start populating the parameters. So I've got a parameter for each one. I've got one for email, and so the email subject. I've got one for the webhook, which is our webhook message content, and one for the JMS as well, which is JMS message content. So the content, basically either the email subject or the content of these triggers will be detected by this workbench. The next thing we'll want to do is start populating the outputs, and we're going to start with the brochure and the coffee. So what I've actually done is I've actually prepared another workbench, getting ready for these. And this is called the message publish workbench. And basically all this is that this is just a RabbitMQ message broker connector that's just going to publish a message that it receives on this input parameter. And for the input parameter, what we're actually going to do is we're going to go to the workspace and go to this brochure output, and we'll see that we've got content. And the reason that we do have content is that I've actually made it available through the automation writer. If we jump back to the automation writer and have a look on brochure, the one attribute that I'm passing out is content. And that's why we can see it here. Click apply, and we're going to be publishing a message. I want to do the same thing with my coffee, is just run a workspace demo, publish a message, exact same process here. I just want to go to the workspace, coffee, content, done. And that's all I want for brochure and coffee at the moment. Currently, when they run, they'll just publish to our broker. I have a plan for receiving that message as part of my streams demonstration, so we're just going to put a pin in those for now. Next, we're going to look at our coffee request. And it occurs to me that I've actually attached coffee to this. That's incorrect. That shouldn't be attached to coffee. It should be attached to jokes, is what I meant. So, coffee. We are going to make a HTTP request for coffee. Not a HTTP request, an email. We're going to send an email for coffee, is what I mean. So, we're going to attach this external action to coffee. If it stops running away on me. It's still running away on me. It's because I'm overlapping the output port, so you can actually auto snap and quick connect these, and I have bad habits because I ignore them. So I'm going to send an email, and just as with the input, with the receiving an email, I can specify a template. It's going to be Gmail. The account that I'm using is fme.server.month@gmail.com. The password is none of your business. I'm not telling you. Email to. I'm going to send an email to my wife. I'm sure she'll approve. Email from. I'm not going to say it was from me. I'm going to say it was from my automated system. Subject. Coffee time with an exclamation mark. And the email body can be, I love. It is coffee time for Sam. Oops. I'm sure she'll thoroughly approve of this. Let's validate that. Just as with the triggers, you can validate, make sure this is going to work, and it has quickly polled and said it is valid. So I'm going to hit apply. And now when we have this coffee action happen, we'll be sending an email to my wife to request coffee. Sounds like a good idea. Now let's start looking at a couple of external HTTP requests. So select action, and I'm going to make a HTTP request. And what I'm going to do is that I'm actually going to reference a webhook that I've implemented in my Slack instance. So I can actually specify my my webhook as my target URL, and I don't need to authenticate it. The format is JSON. So the only thing I really need to do at the moment is specify the body. So this is a different approach to me actually sending a message to Slack aside from the connector. And it's another good example of you can do the same thing multiple different ways in FME Server. With the connector, it's very straightforward, very simple, just send a message. With this approach of using the webhook, I can actually start to really format the messages and put a bit of a spin on it and a bit of a flair, which we'll see shortly. So I'm going to occupy this body, and I've just got something sitting to the side that I can use. So basically, this is going to have a block of text that's titled "Successful Request Sent" with a green bar beside it, because green is the color of go. It was good, and specify that sweet coffee is on the way. Let's click OK, and that HTTP request is there. I'm going to copy that and paste it, and get rid of this section here. And I'm going to attach this to the invalid port now, because I also want to send a message for when I have an invalid request, when what I sent to FME Server was not recognized. And the only thing I need to change here is the message body. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to change it so it pretty much has a "you did the wrong thing" kind of message. So failed to execute request, it's going to have red, and it's going to tell you why it failed. Done. The final one that I'm going to do is for this message one. So again, I'm going to copy and paste the HTTP request, and I'm going to drop it here, and I'm going to put it there, attach it there, and open it up. And the only thing I'm going to change is the body again. I'm polling the same webhook, I'm just changing the message body that was sent. Now this time around, I'm going to give it a color of orange. I'm just going to have it say the message was sent, and it's going to say what the message was, because if I run the message command under this design, basically it just takes what my message was and forwards it on to Slack. So that's pretty much what we're going to do with this for now. So let's start running it. I'm going to click the Start Automation button. And everything goes right. Yep, starts fine. And just like I did before, I'm going to drag this over so we can actually see Slack, and we're going to look at the email browser as well, since we've got a heap of email stuff happening. Let's start with Slack. And the way that this is set up now is that we need to start anything we do with the run. The webhook that's sending to the FME trigger is sensitive to this !run command. And that's not controlled by FME Server, that's controlled by the Slack integration, because Slack integration is really easy to manage. So all we need to do is reference one of our commands that we've included in this workbench, and let's start with a message. And the message that we're going to say is "hello there." And this will do a roundabout basically, or it should, where I send it to FME Server. FME Server goes, "Oh, you sent me a message," and sends it right back. And that's exactly what it does. We've got a message sent, and the message is "hello there." Let's try another one where we'll request coffee, and that will basically send the email off to my wife, which I'm sure she'll be happy about. And we've got FME bot coming back to us saying that that's been successfully sent. Now at the same time, let's just put run nothing, because nothing's not a valid command, and if I put run nothing in there, it's failed to execute it because the invalid request nothing. So excellent, that's working as we would want it to. Let's now run it from the emails. I'm going to test a couple of emails, so I'll send them now. So firstly, we should see an email come in which sends another message. And what you'll see is you'll see the email come into the FME Server month Gmail. Then you'll see that actually be read by FME Server. So basically, it should be read. I think the new notification will go. Nope, didn't. Okay, doesn't matter. Either way, we get message sent, message testing from an email now, and that's exactly what we can see in this body here as well, testing from an email now. And again, we can try a invalid request. So send an invalid request to that email, and hopefully we'll see it respond correctly. There it is. Bad email. No bad email I can spell. I just can't read evidently. So cool. That's working from the emails. That's working from the webhook. This looks really good. I'm not going to do it from the message broker simply because I actually don't have active MQ instanced on the EC2 server. Oh, and I've just gotten a email back from my wife saying, "Get your own coffee." All right, let's say that didn't pass UAT. It didn't pass user acceptance testing. But apart from that, everything's working really well. And quickly maximize this again, and let's quickly move over to the last topic for this webinar, which is streams. Streams is a feature that popped up in this year's release that allows you to run a workspace continuously, regardless of the outcome of each individual run. This creates a persistent job that will not be cancelled by terminations and other complexities, which makes it very useful for high demand and high availability requirements. The main idea of streams is to have a workbench that has a streaming transformer. Now, basically, this is a transformer that can act as a listener of sorts and trigger the downstream processes in the workbench each time it is invoked. Luckily for us, the RabbitMQ connector is a streaming transformer. So let's quickly dive back into that first workbench we did to adjust it to work with streams. And the first and most important part of it is that we need to update the RabbitMQ connector. And the update is that we need to get this actually working as a streaming transformer. And it's really quite simple. We go to receive options, we click on this batch, and we change it to stream. Done. That's all you need to do to update that to a streaming transformer. And what this effectively does is it just removes the batch limitation. Previously, we were running at a batch of 1, so we'll run once and then stop the workbench or stop the transformer. Now we'll run indefinitely and be controlled by the stream. So click OK. The next thing we need to do is we actually need to update our Dropbox connector because there is a bit of an issue here is that we actually specified a local location to write the files to, and that's just not going to fly anymore because I'm about to upload this to FME Cloud, and FME Cloud has no awareness of where my local storage is. So we're going to update that to the shared resource on FME Cloud, so that should be fine. And just as I did with Dropbox connector, I need to do it with the Slack connector as well, as it needs to know where to pull them from. And that should be it. That should be all we need. Just going to now go ahead and publish that. And I went a bit quick there. Just put that in our demo repository. And publish the connections that aren't published. And done. That's all we need. Coming back to the streams page now, and let's get this set up. So in tow with everything else I've done, let's name this demo. And just like all the others, you select a repository in a workspace. So the demo repository and the workbench that we just published, which was the connector integrate. And that's all. Let's click OK. Now, that will create your stream and spin it up, but the stream won't actually be working correctly yet because there's one thing that you need to do. You need to assign an engine to it. And you can find that option just here where you go ahead and click it and you drop down your list of engines. I've only got 2 engines at the moment, and just click the engine you want to use. Now, very important thing to note, and it gives you a warning for it, is that the engine that you assigned to the stream is being reassigned from the queues. It will be removed from the queues and it will not be accessible to generic jobs. It's specifically reserved for this stream. So we click OK. And that's going to spin up the engine and basically create a static job for a static engine for this stream, which is what we want. So let's see the stream in action. And the first thing I'm going to do is drag this over here so we can see the Slack and the message breaker instance again. So the overall process, the workflow that's going to happen here is that I'm going to enter the command into Slack. The automation that we defined earlier is going to identify the command being brochure or joke. If I enter an incorrect command, it should spit back out saying, hey, I don't know what you're talking about. So if I enter just joke, I should get something spit out back at me saying, yeah, joke's invalid. And we get that. So jokes and brochure get sent to the message broker. Now the stream that we've just defined is constantly listening to that same queue that we've defined, which is receive. So we're sending to the receive via the automation, and we're receiving from receive from the stream, which means that when I go ahead and specify run brochure, what this will do is that this will send it to the queue, and we can see that the incoming just spiked a little bit. So we saw a message come in, even though you didn't see the message tally go up because it's been consumed already. And then basically what we should see is if we come over here, we can see that a brochure has been added, which it wasn't there before, which is great. And just to prove that it's coming in and I didn't just sneak it in there, let's put jokes there as well, run jokes. And while that's arriving, we can actually go to the log and we can see that it is pulling the file. So the Dropbox thread jokes.txt, and there's our jokes.txt in the Slack instance. So basically, we're doing a very roundabout thing, but it's still a good proof of concept that this is highly integratable using FME Server. Yes, I'm going in and out with my files, but it still is a good demonstration of how easy this has been to set up as a whole. And with that, I think it's about high time that I wrapped up this webinar. I hope this has provided some insight into how you would go about integrating FME Server with different services, different environments, different patterns, how easy it is to get started and just plug and play and go. As always, if you have any questions, feel free to get in touch with me via the email that I linked at the start or via my LinkedIn account, both referenced at the start of this webinar. And in the meantime, have a lovely day.